So good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tiff Macklem. I have the great privilege of being the Dean of the Rotman School of Management. And as we get started, importantly, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional home of the Seneca and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. I'm a big fan of Public Policy Forum events, and I'm even happier when we have them here at U of T, because I only have to come across the street. What I particularly appreciate about the PPF, and I think under Ed's leadership, we've really seen redoubled focus on bringing together the best experts on the most pressing and most difficult policy issues. And I'm thrilled we have leading academics here this evening, leaders from the private sector, and leaders advising and advising policymakers and contributing to public policy. And that's exactly what you want to do. You know, these problems are very difficult. None of us can solve them on our own, but if we put our heads together, we've got a chance. So thank you, Ed, for getting us together. The topic, of course, is automation and the potential impact on employment, and particularly the political economy implications, and hopefully some solutions, Peter. I can't think of a more immediate issue. As somebody who gets a view into companies, what I see is that, 3-4 years ago, companies started to hire data scientists, hire computer scientists, get some use cases, get some data. They figured out this stuff works for many purposes. And now what they're doing is they're trying to build more of a platform. They're bringing in standardized tools, they're going to cloud-based solutions, and they're creating platforms for the applications of machine learning, blockchain within their companies. But what they haven't really thought much about, they're only just starting to think about, are what are the workplace implications of that? How do we redesign jobs to take advantage of this technology? How do we retrain people? U of T is very much at the center of a lot of these debates on the science side. Jeff Hinton and his colleagues in computer science have really the godfathers of machine learning. But U of T is a deep, rich place. Some of you have probably seen the new Schwartz Reisman Innovation Center. And as part of that, it's not going to just be about the science of AI. It has also got a new center to look at the ethical implications of AI. Here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, researchers are focusing on the Future Skills Faculty Initiative, which is really about how do we, as an educational institution, how do we respond? How do we prepare the workforce of the future? And at Rotman, we've been very focused, particularly on machine learning and AI for a number of years, and trying to help convert the science leadership we have in Canada into commercial success and build that ecosystem. There are all kinds of estimates about how many jobs will be displaced by these technologies, some as high as 50%. The most recent ones, I would say, are getting a bit more sophisticated. It's less about jobs, more about tasks. And the latest number I've seen is 93% of workers have at least one important task that is going to be automated. So this isn't, somebody else's problem. This is all of our problem. And we are thrilled to have Peter Loewen to lead us off in a wonderful panel to discuss it. But my real job is to introduce Ed Greenspon, who is the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Ed has worked at the intersection of public policy and journalism for at least 30 years. He comes from a distinguished line of editor-in-chiefs at the Globe and Mail. He's been at the Star, Bloomberg, but I think he's really found his natural home at the Public Policy Forum, and Ed, certainly, we've noticed your leadership, and it's most welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Tiff, for those
kind and generous words, and congratulations on the release of your report on sustainable finance. Tiff and I got to share a few meetings across the country on the subject, including one in Calgary, which was we had the exit right near our back, but we didn't have to use it. It was excellent. It was a good time. So thank you, and thanks for the University of Toronto, which is an active member and a great supporter of the Public Policy Forum. I was going to, at this stage, do a land acknowledgement, but I guess I don't have to. I should do the land acknowledgement now. But I always like to sort of, when I do land acknowledgement in Toronto, I like to make mention of the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, because I think it's such a farsighted. It was such a farsighted, essentially like a free trade treaty and an environmental accord, stuck together, and great foresight, and in a way, anticipating the kinds of issues that we're in today, particularly around the environment and new needs for trade, issues that you can wrap your head around very well. Most of you, I think, know Public Policy Forum, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. We're 1/3 of a century old, which is, I suppose, 1/450th as long as actually this land has been inhabited around here. We're 200 plus members strong, and we are, trying, as Tiff says, to tackle difficult issues with broad groups of people with a lot of tension in the room and different perspectives on it, to hopefully arrive at pathways that will make for a better country. And through the process of the aggravating process of having to deal with people who don't agree with you, that wonderful aggravating process known as democracy, at its best days, come to policy solutions that will be sustainable, that can be embraced by large numbers of people. So this issue is, as Tiff says, as perplexing as any in many ways. The human side of technological change, and how human beings will adjust, and how policy will do its job to assure that both the upside is inclusive, and that the downside is mitigated for people who will be harmed by it. So we're going to have a good conversation about that tonight. I should forewarn you that we are not under Chatham House rules. Every time you hear Chatham House rules, it's Chatham House rules. But we're not in Chatham House rules. This is an on-the-record event. My colleague, Tomek, in the back, you can wave at people. We'll both be tweeting and taking some pictures. So so keep that in mind. Tonight's a bit of a warm-up conversation for tomorrow, where we have a major conference called Brave New Work, and this is part of a 3-year project that the Public Policy Forum is deeply involved with. It's one of our major, if not our biggest focal point over the next 3 years, to try to help decision makers, whether they're in government, whether they're in business, whether they're in the union movement, whether they're in universities and colleges and other institutions of learning, wherever they may be, to try to come to grips with the world as it's unfolding. We're delighted at the confidence that's been shown to us by our sort of growing coterie of partners on this project, including the Business Council of Canada, Canadian Bankers Association, Deloitte, General Motors Canada, Cogeco, ISET and the SDC, the Metcalf Foundation, Unifor, Hill and Knowlton, and our lead sponsor, for whom we're eternally grateful for really helping us get the ball rolling and showing that confidence in us, and that the TD Bank Group. So thank you all for your support for that. And speaking of TD, TD is represented here tonight, well, by several people, but coming up is Norie Campbell, its group head, customer and colleague experience. Norie leads the teams responsible for human resources, marketing, corporate and public affairs, and enterprise projects. That's a lot of responsibility right there. And is chair as well of TD's Enterprise-Wide Inclusion and Diversity Leadership Council. So she breathes the future work every day.
And Norie's been awarded Canada's Top 40 Under 40 distinction, recognized as one of Canada's most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network. That doesn't sound powerful, like in a good way, though, right? Not in a coercive way, but in a good way, right? And is a 2018 WXN Hall of Fame inductee and was honored by the Directors Roundtable with a world recognition of Distinguished General Counsel Award. So I'd like to ask Norie to come up and say a few introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Ed, and I'm just so thrilled to be here tonight with all of you on this very important topic of getting ready for Canada's jobs of the future. I just wanted to share a little on our own perspective at TD. I think there is a very interesting conundrum for business leaders across Canada, really a paradox as we think about what we know, and as Tiff talked about in his piece, that as technology augments humans, we will see some continued impact on at least tasks and probably jobs. At the same time, if you survey CEOs in Canada and globally on their biggest worry, it is almost always, will I have the talent I need to be successful in the future? And so this is a very interesting time for leaders to be living in as they think about their talent challenges for the future, to hold those two very contradictory thoughts in their head. What is absolutely certain is that we will need new skills tomorrow than those that we have today. So I wanted to share with you, we had last week, we had together 2,000 of the most senior leaders across TD Bank here in Toronto, and I shared some research that we had done on our own people with them as the leaders who will be bringing the bank through this paradox. So we now have about 85,000 employees, principally in Canada and the United States at TD. And when we surveyed them on how they're feeling about work, what we thought was very interesting is they are very aware. Maybe you think that is obvious. They're very aware of what is happening and the challenges ahead in the workforce. But when we asked them, how would you feel about this? 92% of our employees said they want to devote their own time and their own energy to learning the skills that they need for the future. And we asked them, what word would you feel if we announced to you a reskilling program? And they said the three top words were interested, enthusiastic, excited. And interestingly, 13% of them said joy. I do think that this is a very interesting set of research out of our own organization. I think it says that they have very high expectations of us as leaders. I'm excited about that. I think for the bank, they really do expect a lot from the leadership team, and I intend to deliver. We do think, though, as we think about this sort of tough nut to crack at TD with our very strong set of resources and assets and 85,000 people, when we then thought about how does that feel in the communities in which we serve, where our colleagues live, work, and play, how is that feeling? And this is really what, as the impetus behind us wanting to work with the Public Policy Forum and with Ed and his team. This work is part of the READY commitment at TD, which is our commitment to target giving, charitable giving of $1 billion by 2030 to make a more inclusive future for all. We're very pleased to be partnering with the Public Policy Forum for the reasons that Tiff indicated in his piece. We know a very highly regarded organization, very well placed to get the right voices for this important discussion that will be both constructive but also challenging, which I think is critically important. Creative, thoughtful, well-researched. So I would say it is our joy to be part of this work. This is very important work for Canada, certainly to have the skills we needed, as is on the minds of the CEOs here and globally. But I feel quite confident about that part. I think the bigger challenge for leaders, and as we look back at how these disruptive times have impacted workforce through the years, the bigger challenge is how can we help as many people as we can to come through this without bumps and bruises. As we think about it, how can we make people feel more confident, full of optimism for the future, ready for tomorrow? That's how success, I think, will be judged. And so we look very forward to participating in this dialogue. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Norie. And I'm going to bring up the main presenter, and we'll look. This is The future work issue is obviously one that all countries are struggling with. It's one you want to get right, and it's one you definitely don't want to get wrong. And when you get it wrong, there's consequences. There's historical precedents for this, but I don't think there's an historical precedent with the speed and the force of change occurring in the way that it's occurring today. And so, in the long run, as my economist friends say, everything sort of rebalances itself and works out, but politics and society live in a shorter run usually. So we need, people need to feel that they're being treated fairly, and policy needs to be smart. And we need to understand the currents of public opinion as well as the politics. So we have PPF. We've commissioned some research papers as part of our Brave New Work project. This is our first beginning of our process. Is the research papers, three of five of which of the initial group have now been published, and the one that was published actually today is produced by Peter Loewen. It's a deep piece of research into public opinion, particularly among the group of people who are the most economically vulnerable. But I'll leave Peter to describe this. Peter is a powerful intellect and a very persuasive person, and we'll see if he persuades you as well. That is powerful, of course, in a non-coercive manner as also. So just to keep consistent here. Peter is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. He works on questions around elite and citizen behavior and the role of technology in improving governance and representation. Peter is a senior fellow at Massey College across the street, and perhaps just, or more importantly, a fellow at the Public Policy Forum right here with us today. For the 2018-19 academic year, Peter has been a fellow at Stanford University Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Science. I think he flew in from San Francisco today. I see he's wearing no socks, so I can assume he was in California earlier in the day. And he's been doing a lot of hard thinking and a lot of hard digging on the subject, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say. Peter.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming. I do want to acknowledge very sincerely the great honor it is to be a fellow at the Public Policy Forum. Sometimes people like Sean Spears sneak through, but for the most part, it's a really distinguished group of people, and I'm really glad to be a part of that group. If you know Sean, he's just written a great paper on the intangible economy that I would encourage you to read. It's pretty closely related to what we're talking about in important ways, particularly when we get down to policy implications. I want to acknowledge as well that the work that I'm talking about today was done in full partnership with Ben Allen Stevens, who's right here, the fellow in the plaid shirt. Ben is a research associate at the Munk School of Global Affairs. I have the pleasure of working with him pretty closely almost every day, virtually, and he's been a wonderful collaborator and a great asset here at the school. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about forward-looking work, and I've tried to be a little more anticipatory in my research lately, and to look forward and try and get a sense of what's happening in our world. And what I want to do today is just explore, and have you explore with me, the connection between the dislocation and the disruption that's coming on, that's onsetting from automation, from artificial intelligence, and this other force that we see in our world today, which is populism. This kind of bundle of things that politicians are doing and this style of politics that politicians are undertaking, which is disrupting political systems, chipping away at democratic norms, eroding the international order at the highest level. So the paper, which you can read, and I would commend you to read it and to send us whatever comments you've got. Goes through a lot of things. The things I really want to emphasize today are the following. I'll do it in a relatively rapid-fire way. I want to make a few observations on automation and artificial intelligence, mostly just to put my own kind of posteriors out there so you have a sense of what I think about this and how I think about it. I want to talk a little bit about populism and nativism and just do some clarifying around concepts because it's important to make some distinctions and to link these things into the future of work. I'll talk about our data very quickly, and then I'll present you with sort of 4 sets of findings. One is about the relationship between people's perceptions of, one is about the relationship between people's objective exposure to job loss via automation and artificial intelligence, AAI. The second is the relationship between people's perceptions of AI and job loss. Then we'll talk about the most important stuff, which is what people think the social impacts of automation and AI are going to be, how those link into kind of attitudes around populism and nativism, and then how they link into people's policy preferences. And what you're going to find, so I won't make it a mystery novel, I'll tell you now, that what you're going to find is the following, is that people who have a heightened sense of loss and worry about the dislocation that's coming via automation and artificial intelligence are more likely to support populist politics as a style. They're more likely to support nativist policy options around closing borders and things like that. And the more positive thing is they're very keen for government to take any sort of action at all. And I'll talk about the kind of actions they want government to take. But what they want is something to be done about this thing about which they worry. And underwriting all that, the kind of thread that runs through it all is that it's people's perceptions of job loss that matter, not their objective exposure to job loss. This makes this a very challenging political and public policy matter. Right? So we'll get into it here. I'll just say a few things about automation and about the way I think about it, and let's just take AI as a subset of automation in a sense. They're different things, but you can think about them as one's almost a class of the other. This is a nice chart that comes from a McKinsey report that's now 2 years old. I think it's still a great report to read. And it was one of the first that said that what the kind of way we should look at automation is to break things down in terms of tasks, not in terms of jobs. And to have people think about all the things they do in their job and then think about how many of those tasks can be automated at different levels of efficiency or efficacy, if you will. And the basic story is there's actually a lot of variation. So if you are a landscaping and a groundskeeper worker, for example, so you're down there in the bottom left quadrant, the share of your daily tasks that can be automated is actually quite low, despite your wages being quite low. So there's not a lot of automation potential there. It's actually pretty complicated to look at a lawn and figure out how you're going to cut it and then figure out how you're going to water some plants, and there's a real craft to it. If you're a file clerk, it's a different story, right? So there's a lot of variation. You can see that it tails off in the sense that as you get into higher wage occupations, there's less and less potential for automation. But there's still people like chief executives who McKinsey estimates that something like a quarter of their tasks could be automated if you adapted currently demonstrated technologies. It's probably true, right, in terms of what those tasks are. So the way I think about it is the following when I think about automation and AI. One is that it's going to affect a lot of people, in fact, almost everyone. The statistic that Tiff we derived out of our study that for 93% of people, they've got at least one significant task in their job, which currently demonstrated technology can perform at the highest quartile of performance. At least one task. That's a pretty broad group, but most tasks can't be automated yet at a level of meeting median human performance, for example. So it's going to affect everyone, and I think it's very difficult to predict exactly in which industries it'll onset because there's a whole bunch of commercial decisions that are behind that, and there's a bunch of corporate strategy that's behind it, et cetera, et cetera. But we should expect it to be widespread, and we shouldn't expect to be able to get the location of it right, but we should be able to get the mean of it right. That's my one prior. Let me say a few things about populism. There are some, this is not the most attractive group of people up on this page right now, I'll tell you, but we can go through them as to who they are, and it's worth doing. One, of course, is Viktor Orban in the top left, the current Prime Minister of Hungary, one of the world's great and most effective populists right now. Down in the bottom right, of course, you have Donald Trump and Le Pen, and you have Orban again, and then up in the top right, you've got Le Pen and you've got Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. All 4 unique people identified on that page are quite successful populists, you might argue. And if you wanted to look at their policy platforms and search them for overlap, you could search for a long time to find significant overlap in the things that they support in terms of their policy positions. Their style of politics has a lot of similarities, but the things that they pursue as policy and the reasons that they pursue them, the problems that their politics are an answer to, actually vary quite a lot across those places. What's the main issue that Orban deals with in Hungary? Is it the influx of migrants? The principal issue in Hungary is out-migration of people, that it's a society that is quickly depopulating of young people. That's the animating force of their politics. It's a different story in France, it's a different story in the United States, it's a different story in the Netherlands. What I want you to take from this is that populism is a style of politics about some combination of being anti-system, setting up a core of people against a group of elites, and simplifying and presenting simplified solutions to what are normally quite complex problems. But the other flip side of it is, and I credit Sean with this insight, is that populists happen to be very good at perceiving problems. And I think that where there's kind of a mistranslation or miscommunication in the debate around populism is that we presume that because populists are wrong about solutions, they're wrong about problems. And they're actually most often not wrong about problems, right? They're responding to what citizens say are problems. So it's entrepreneurial, it's flexible, has a lot more to do with the style of politics, which means that when there's a big social disruption that's onsetting, the response of a populist isn't, well, I tend to believe in the market, therefore I'm not going to object to automation. It's to say, I see a big problem here that's dislocating people, and I can put myself against it and hold myself out as a bulwark against it and give easy solutions, and I can win. So let's see if there's any relationship between these things. This is a slide we don't have to spend a lot of time on, but I'll just tell you that we surveyed just south of 2,000 Canadian respondents. It's quasi-representative of the population. It was done online. We do all sorts of statistical weighting in the background to make it representative. Happy to talk about that if you're having trouble sleeping, but we can move on to other stuff. But it's a pretty standard approach to these things. What I want to talk about is more what we measured and how we did it. So the first thing we did is we measured people's exposure to AI. And this is the way we did it. There's a couple of broad ways we could do this, right? We could ask them about what industry they work in, and then we could try to come up with some estimate of their likelihood of dislocation based on the industry they're in. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is ask them for their 4 or 5 digit knock code about the occupation they've got, and they come up with an occupation level. That's estimate's probably good. It's extremely laborious. The approach we took was the following. McKinsey in their report, and we can talk about other ways of doing this, but McKinsey in their report identifies 18 distinct job skills, and I'll show you what these look like in a second. We simply ask individuals in a binary way to ask whether that skill is a part of the job that they do, right? So do they have to follow instructions? Do they have to navigate? Do they have to process language? Do they have to give instructions? There's a whole number of things you can do here. And then you can take those 18 skills. They bundle into 5, cluster into 5 bundles for what it's worth, but you can take those skills and then you can score them in terms of whether there is currently demonstrable technology that performs those broad skills at a level below the human median performance, at the median, or in the top quartile. And then from that you can derive a score, which is effectively a person's individual level exposure to automation. You can think about that score as being kind of the share of their job that could be automated away. The comparative statics are that the mean score is something like 65, which would mean that something like, there's different ways of thinking about it, but a third of jobs could be completely automated, or something like the average person's, all the tasks that a person does for the average person, about 2/3 of those tasks can be performed at an automated level at the human median performance. The more important thing is that 93% of respondents have at least one skill, which current technology performs in the top quartile. Okay? What the share of their job is performed by that skill, something that's beyond our measure right now. There's other ways of measuring it, and we can talk about the correlation of them. But that's how we measure people's exposure to automation and AI. If you chart it, this is what it looks like. You'll see that it's quite normally distributed. There's a real cluster of people who are around that point of 0.5 or 0.6. Some people who live out at the tails, and some people who fortunately live at the zero end where nothing can be automated in terms of their tasks, but there's a big bulk of people for whom some portion of their job can be automated. That's a real politically challenging situation here, right? If you're a policymaker trying to back out where you should target retraining, for example, and it turns out that most nearly everybody's got some tasks that are going to be automated away, figuring out how to effectively and efficiently target becomes quite difficult. Okay, let's get into what people's views are, though. There's no reason people are right about things, but politics is all about things that people get right and get wrong. So we ask people, do you think that your job will be replaced by a computer or a machine within the next 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? What you can see, and if you can see those numbers, you can sign up to be a sniper, but what you can see if you look at the top left panel is that something like 90% of people think that their job in the next 5 years will definitely not or probably not be replaced. But that number goes down as you go to 10 years, and it goes down further if you go to 25 years. People can see over time that there's some replacement coming. Now, people overestimate their talents, people are overconfident, people are inert, so the other way of doing it is to ask them whether they think other people's jobs will be lost to automation. And when you ask them about their friends and family's jobs and how many of them, how much they think, what share of them they think will be replaced in the next 5, 10, and 25 years, you see that people become a little more convinced that automation is going to do something to jobs. Right? It's not overwhelming, right? So there's a couple things you can take away from this. I mean, one is that people may not get the level right. Maybe they have it right, but they've got the trend right? And when you ask them about other people, they see more dislocation coming for others than they do for themselves. That's a bit of a wicked situation, because then when it comes to people, they're not expecting it to come. So there is, depending on how you want to characterize this, substantial belief that some jobs are going to be replaced by automation and AI in the next 5 and 10 and certainly 25 years. What's the consequence of that? We asked people a couple of questions, one around social impact and one around inequality. So we asked them, automation and artificial intelligence will make economic inequality worse in the future, with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And we asked them for their agreement on that statement. And it's the numbers come in at something like 60% of people, 65%, 2/3, believe that automation and artificial intelligence is going to make inequality worse. That's a wide open question about whether it actually will, right? And we can go around the bend. It's a very interesting conversation about how changing nature of work can increase or decrease inequality. But the standing presumption of Canadians is that inequality is going to get worse via automation and AI in the coming years. If you think about social dynamism, which is sort of the process of getting to inequality, we covered it as well. We asked people in the future, will automation and artificial intelligence make it easier for poor people to become richer or harder? And fully 62% of people think it will make it harder for poor people to become richer, and just a quarter think it will, just 10% think it'll make it easier. Now, here's where it gets more interesting. If you divide folks up based on their belief that around the exposure to job loss for themselves and for others, and you divide them into the top half and the bottom half, then you start to see how these things are linked together. So the stack on the left is going to show you the share of people who strongly agree, the top two boxes, that automation is going to make inequality worse in the future. And among people who are below the median in their expected job loss, it's 60% of people. But for those who are above the median, it's on 72, 73%. If you think there's going to be job loss, you think that the aggregate effects of automation and AI are worse for inequality. And similarly, you think that they're worse for social mobility. It's just simply not the case that people think that this stuff can just happen to them and have no social consequences. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Okay, now I want to talk about the higher level order now of whether it links into populism and nativism. I want to do a couple of things. One is I want to just note that populism and nativism are analytically distinct things. Populism is this kind of anti-elite, anti-politic sentiment that, there's a common man out there and he has common wisdom, and elites keep us from achieving that common wisdom, for example. And there's other ways you can think about it. Nativism describes a preference for some real, authentic population over outsiders. This belief that there's some core group of people and they need to be protected against a group that exists outside of your country. You put them together and you get a kind of a right-wing populism that you see in many parts of the world, but they can exist independently of one another, right? They don't have to run together. In fact, whatever your views are, for example, on the current government in this province across the street, it's hard to knock them as being nativist. It's not hard to knock them as being populist. Right? You can pin one of those labels on them better than you can pin the other ones on. So you can break them apart. So we try to get a sense of how populist people are. This is the kind of questions we ask for agreement or disagreement. We ask them things like, the Canadian economy is rigged to the advantage of the rich and powerful. You can all read, but you see what we're getting at here, right? And these things analytically form a single kind of big dimension that you can work off of. And it's consistent and it's reliable and it all kind of hangs together. It has things like Canada needing a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful, and politicians being able to say what's on their mind, regardless of what anyone thinks about their views. And then, of course, reverse-coded things like, I trust the government to do the right thing. Nativism is something else. It's people's agreement with notions that, for example, immigrants take jobs away from Canadians, immigrants take important social services away, Canada would be better off if we didn't let so many immigrants in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's been a long time in our politics since we've had a party that was explicitly nativist, but not a long time since we've had a party that's been explicitly populist. Indeed, I can tell you an interesting result out of our study near the end on that matter. Okay, so this is what it looks like then if you look at the distribution of populism for those on the left who are below the median in terms of their concern about job loss. They don't think there's going to be big effects, and those on the right. And you can see that there's a lot more, it's called left skew, but it's actually pushes more to the right. There's higher degrees of populism among those who are above the median and they're worried about job loss through automation and AI. And there's higher degrees of nativism as well. If you put these into a multiple regression and you put it in all your control variables and you try to wash away the effect, it just doesn't go away. Those who anticipate greater job loss are more populist, they're more nativist. The final thing we did is we tried to get a sense of what sort of policies people would take from government. And we're not here trying to get down to the nuance of exactly what policies are ideal, so we're not asking people about whether capital gains should be pegged at 50% of the marginal rate or 45%, as excited as that might get some people in this room. We're not interested in the public's views on that. What we wanted to do was kind of give them two options. We wanted them to say, look, here are two statements. We want to see which one you agree with more to kind of mimic the nature of political debate. So one thing we say is, look, automation and artificial intelligence are going to take away a large number of jobs, so the federal government should begin decreasing immigration of skilled workers from other countries. That's an action government can take, right? Or there's a kind of a position that says government can't do much to stop automation and AI, taking away jobs. Workers should just prepare themselves for the changes that are coming. And what we want to know is what policies, if you put them in that kind of positive light of government taking action, will people support? So what I want to show you is the range of policies they'll support, and I'm going to show you how they differ in terms of people's exposure to job loss. So there's a whole number of policies that we put in front of them, and here's what they are in case your eyes are as bad as mine. We asked them going from left to right, where there's more support down to less support. And that red line is 50%, which indicates that the majority of people chose the policy over inaction, right? One is, should government provide tax incentives to companies to retrain workers? 63% say yes versus do nothing. 37% say do nothing. Spend more on STEM university education, 57%. Retrain older adults, 55%. And then there's a slew of policies that are not majority supported. Favor companies that have displaced workers for government, that haven't displaced workers for government procurement, more generous EI, decrease unskilled worker immigration, have tax punishment for corporations that displace workers, or decrease skilled worker immigration. So long story short, the majority of people support things around training and kind of positive policy actions. They don't support the more reactionary style things around government punishing or government shutting down borders. But it differs when you break people up according to their fear of job loss. So here's what it looks like. Again, people on the left are those who are below the median in job loss, and those on the right are those who are above. The lighter blue bars are going to be the agreement with the more positive policy action. So if you're below the median in job loss, you're not worried about job loss, only 33% of people say government should decrease unskilled worker immigration. But 41% of people who fear job loss support it. It's an 8% increase. If you ask them about skilled immigration, there's no real effect. It's good news. If you ask them about STEM, there's more support among those who are fearing job loss, but not that much more. If you ask them about retraining older adults, again, more support and even more support among those who fear job loss. Same story for tax incentives for companies to retrain workers. Support among everybody, but especially more support among those who fear job loss. Same thing for more generous EI benefits. More support among those who fear more job loss. The story is essentially the same. And if you put all these things together, the story that comes out of it is, long story short, that people who are fearing more job loss are willing to support any set of packages that the government puts in front of them. Okay. Let me just talk quickly about the policy and political implications of this, then I look forward to our discussion. One point is this just comes out of the data, is that there's a remarkable mismatch between people's job loss expectations and their actual exposure to AI. It's just a huge misalignment between what jobs people are doing and how exposed they believe themselves to be to job loss. It's very challenging for government, right? And when you hear, for example, in the opening remarks that people are eager at TD to retrain themselves and to figure out what they need to learn, that's a highly in some sense, probably quite a highly informed workforce that can see where their tasks are coming and can see the changes that are coming in their jobs. But for those people who don't see the misalignment between what they're doing and what the future looks like, it's very challenging for government, right? As opposed to a situation where people know an industry is shutting down and they need to retrain themselves. The political implications are that parties can craft proactive, broad policy packages to address AI. There's as much appetite for sensible policy on this as there is for reactionary policy, and it's wide open for parties to put together a package of things. And they can link those policies into people's worries and into their concerns. That's a wonderful opportunity for political parties to have, right? To know that there's some concern and some worry out there, and they can actually put something positive in front of people about it. Those policies, if they're effective, are going to address the wider societal implications of AI. This is something where, in automation, where when people look into the future, they don't only see job loss, but they see pretty negative, starkly negative societal consequences in terms of what automation and AI are going to do. So if policies and political actors and entrepreneurs are serious about this matter, then what they ought to be doing is not only talking about what they're doing at an individual level, but thinking about how they're going to address the larger societal impacts of AI, and I look forward to us talking about that. And the final thing here is that the policy field's wide open for every party. So we asked respondents, for example, which party do you think is best at managing technological change? There's no relationship between people's views on that and their concern about job loss. Okay? People who are more concerned about job loss have the same sense about which parties are better as those who don't fear job loss. Similarly, there's no relationship between people's fear of job loss and which party they're supporting today. Right? So any party can be addressing this, and they're speaking to their own voters. Populism is pushing voters around right now, and nativism is pushing voters around right now. I'm happy to talk about how it's doing that. But once you net those things out, people's concern about the future with jobs is as likely to drive them to vote for Party A as for Party B. And by our lights, that creates a great opportunity for political entrepreneurs to grab this issue and do as much with it as they can in sensible ways, rather than kind of leaving the field to those who are going to react and bring out the worst in people in reaction to change. I'll leave it at that and say I look forward to the conversation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Lisa and Jane, do you want to come up? And right on. It's like scary. All right, so we're going to have a little discussion centered on Peter's research, but not exclusively on Peter's research. And we're joined up here by Jane Badets on my far right, who is the Assistant Chief Statistician for Social Health and Labor Statistics at Statistics Canada. So every day you read in a newspaper, for those of you who still read a newspaper, StatsCan said, that's Jane, who's saying those things or picking up that data. She has the responsibility for a broad range of social statistics, including health, justice, education, labor, income, immigration, tourism, Indigenous peoples, and demography. And on my immediate right is Lisa Kimmel, and Lisa oversees Edelman's Canadian and Latin American operations and sits on its Global Operations Committee. In her role, she provides senior counsel of clients and is responsible for the growth strategies in the region. Edelman has distinguished itself in recent years with its attempts to understand the erosion of trust in institutions and a lot of work on understanding, I think, the consequences and implications of digital developments in society. So glad that you can both join us, and thank you for that presentation, Peter. I sort of feel sort of almost encouraged, which is not the natural disposition for somebody who spent so long in journalism to feel positive. But amidst that, I see that, people are prone to populism and nativism, but they want policy solutions first and foremost. So it gives us who are talking about how policy will interact with the kinds of societal changes that we're seeing. It gives us a chance, essentially, to get it right. So the test and the hard part is getting it right, because policy is never easy, and this doesn't make it easy at all. But that's me. I'm glass half full. How about you? Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? How would you describe it?
I mean, I think that I'm relatively optimistic on these. I'm relatively optimistic on these matters. I mean, the nice thing about the way automation and AI ought to roll out is that it's sort of increasingly gone are the days where whole concerns are shut down at once, right? Where, I mean, it still happens, and some people still wear the scars of managing that, but it still happens. But I think that the way retraining works and the way that reshaping organizations works is just not as dramatic as it was before. So that's the first point, which means that there's less sparks out there to start fires. And the other one is that I think that people are more ready for this shift, for example, than they were the automation wave that rolled through the United States in the 1980s. Right? I mean, if you look at job loss in advanced manufacturing in the U.S., the amount of it that's attributable to offshoring is actually quite low, right? Most of it's attributable to automation, and people still believe that it was attributable to offshoring, right? That tells you that it hit in a way where people were just not informed. Were not informed about it. We're having conversations now already about how AI is going to have big effects on the economy. It makes me think that when it happens, people are going to be more ready for it than they were before, which is a positive thing for government. And the second thing I would say,
although by the same token, you said that you thought people are going to be shocked because they're underestimating the effect.
yeah,
Right?
individuals are going to be shocked, right? But they're not going to have a misapprehension about what happened, for example, right? So think about how much, and I'll just leave it at this: how much political debate in the U.S. right now is driven by myths around where jobs went in the 1980s. There's not going to be as many myths in this case. People will know perhaps exactly what the culprit was. And the final thing I'll add on that is that the amount of interaction between people and retraining and higher education now compared to 30 years ago is dramatic. The number of people who have gone to college, have gone to university, have experience in educational institutions, and can in the future go in and out of these places to retrain is better than it ever was before. So I think that the fundamentals are a little easier to manage politically. You've got better knowledge about what's going on. People will understand it better. There'll be less myth, and there's probably more actually institutional fixes at hand than there was 30 years ago when the last wave of automation came through.
Right. Lisa, in your 2019 Trust Barometer, you showed that Canadians are expecting more from their employers, particularly, more from their employers, and that they trust them more to respond than they do politicians, media, and even nonprofit institutions. So how do we explain that? And I guess, the number one policy preference in Peter's work here was incentives for companies to retrain workers, and I guess that's exactly what workers want, right?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about the Edelman Trust Barometer for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. We've been doing it for the last 19 years, and it looks at trust across the four institutions that Ed mentioned: government, business, media, and NGOs. And what we've seen over time in all of the 26 markets where we do the survey, including Canada, is a decline in trust across all of those institutions. And this year, as a result of that continued decline that we've seen, we actually asked respondents specifically about their trust in their employer. And not surprisingly, given that we've seen this decline in trust in these four other institutions, that 80% of Canadian respondents actually trust their employer. So that actually creates tremendous opportunity for businesses to be addressing the concerns that workers do have. And one of the things that we did see is that there is a significant amount of fear around job loss and job insecurity. And so, as an example, 53% of respondents are concerned about not having the skills necessary to get a good paying job. 52% of Canadian respondents said that they were concerned about automation taking away their jobs. So what it does mean is that companies do have the opportunity to provide that retraining and the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow.
Okay, so I want to come back to that in a minute, and I want you all feel free to interact with each other's responses, because I'm just going to go to Jane for a minute to talk about some, very interesting piece of research that Jane was kind enough to send me. I suppose I could have found it on a website somewhere, but it's on job quality, essentially. And the job quality shows that, there's a significant group of people who in measuring job quality, they have little training, they have few benefits, they have poor social environments in which they work, and there's, I think, a number of other criteria that describes that. So who are those people? Who's most likely to be in those low quality jobs, and how is that expressed? How is that expressed in their lives?
Well, yeah, yes, Stats Canada is very much looking at this issue of automation in the future of work. We certainly follow it within the context of other changes in the labor market. The labor market is pretty complex. And so, just in 1 month, you'll have 600,000 people changing their job status in Canada. So there's lots of dimensions that affect that. One of the aspects that we are looking at is job quality. So certainly skills is one, and how is skills changing, and how does that relate to occupations? But job quality, so we took a multidimensional approach. We used data from a number of indicators, both sort of factual and objective, but also from our general social survey, which we conduct, and we had a cycle on 20,000 Canadians we asked about work and at home. So what we looked at, and we developed an international framework looking at job quality, whether it's income and benefits, career prospects, work intensity, work time, quality, etc. And some of the larger or fastest growing sectors, example, healthcare, accommodation, those had the lowest job quality overall when we rated those. Job quality, not surprisingly, tends to be higher in more professional and in public admin as well, just in all the dimensions. But some of the average job, where there was average job quality, was in education, trades, and transportation. And in particular, those people doing very atypical, non-standard, they're on limited contracts, which is probably one of the what we're looking at in terms of the gig economy. They had the lowest job satisfaction, lowest job quality, and the most precarious. So
if we think that employers are looking to their employer to help, and I don't know if that's even more than government. Perhaps you can help us with that. But are employers prepared? I mean, in Canada, there's very low spending on training by employers vis-a-vis OECD averages, and I think even vis-a-vis the United States, the Canadian training is very low, and companies say that they can't capture the benefits. They're afraid the benefits will leak out. So, in some way, are employers being set up for a big fall here if they, as they disappoint their workers?
So what I would say is that it's an opportunity. It's not something that they should look at and frown upon, that opportunity, because it creates a trust advantage for an employer. If they're willing to invest in retraining, it will result in employees who will be more loyal to the company, who will be empowered and will be engaged to do more and actually want to stay at the company if companies are actually investing in them and their futures.
So the CEOs that and many CEOs, do they feel, again, in Peter's question, there was this idea of incentives paid to companies for training. Do they feel the need for incentives?
I have not had discussions specifically around incentives, but I do think that there is opportunity for government and business to be working in partnership to figure out solutions that will work to the benefit of employees in Canada.
Okay.
So in our job quality, firm size made a big difference to job quality. So that's probably related to, training as well, the ability, for career prospects. So that's an important element as well in terms of who can offer better job quality versus others that maybe need more help or are struggling there.
Can you describe also in the quality work, Jane? There's a number of I think in the work it talks about a polarized job market. Maybe you could describe a little bit some of the polls in that polarized job market.
Yeah, we're starting to see where employment growth is starting to be a bit polarized. High-skilled professional jobs versus the low-skilled service. I mean, that's been going on for a while. It's not new. And there's a kind of a hollowing out of the middle. So is that a divided labor market? That's kind of a high level. But we looked at things like compensation quality, employment security, work environment, which is very important as well. We have done some studies around Canadians in terms of their life satisfaction and work-life balance. What's coming out very clearly, while generally Canadians see technology as important, they're also very concerned about work-life balance and just life satisfaction in general. And that kind of plays out differently across the country. It plays out differently across the life course as well, millennials versus Gen Xers, et cetera.
I was very struck that healthcare, hospitality industries, construction, particularly, areas of growth for jobs were very low on the quality scale, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. And that may be the work environment. And we know healthcare workers increasingly, it tends to be gender biased, certainly on the lower paid elements, and as an aging society. So they may not feel, that the work environment is even safe, or in terms of their ability around autonomy and decision-making and flexibility. So I think those are all elements that we have to look at going forward in the types of jobs that are the new jobs as well, and what we can do in terms of assisting workers.
I'd like you, Peter, I'll start with you, but I'd like you all to comment on this perhaps. I just wonder were you surprised at all that with the very strong views that technology exacerbates social equality, that technology is exacerbating social mobility, I guess. What's the message there for that people are giving us?
Yeah, I don't. It's a stark set of findings. I don't know what the source of them is, right? What the sources are, but it's worth noting that people understand that people's association of technology is that it exists among these 5 or 6 big companies, and they think that these are the technology companies, and I think they just kind of know the game that's going on here, right? That these companies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and richer and richer and richer, and it underwrites a narrative that this stuff leads to rich people getting richer and poor people being poor but having perhaps some better services. So I think that's part of it, and certainly. If you want to know where the entry point is for populist politicians, it's going to be around how they manage big technology companies. Those are big fights to have, and I wouldn't relish anybody taking them on. But those are fights where if politicians want to make hay about populism, they can do it there, right? Which is actually good for people who are worried about labor markets, because these companies don't employ a lot of people actually. Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Amazon more than others, but that seems to be the most likely culprit for me of where this notion of technology exacerbating inequalities.
Are you saying this is fertile ground for populist politicians, or is it fertile ground also for system politicians to earn their spurs with the public?
Look, it can be both, right? But if it's genuinely, this is sort of the lesson of populism. If it's genuinely a public problem that the public is concerned about, populists will get there before other people.
Populists will get there before the people. Wow, that sounds worrying.
But they do, right? Time and again they do.
Populists may already be there, I suppose.
They may already be there. Yeah.
One of the interesting things that we look at each year is various sectors and trust in various sectors. And the technology sector has always, in every single year that we've been doing the trust barometer, has been the most trusted sector. And I actually anticipated, based on everything that's happening with all of these companies like Facebook, that we would see a decline in trust in the technology sector this past year. And we actually did not. And I would actually attribute that to the fact that on an individual basis, regardless of everything that's happening and concerns around privacy and influence on political outcomes in elections, et cetera, that people still derive benefit from the technologies that they use, and therefore they continue to trust the sector.
You want to weigh in on that, Jen?
Well, I mean, we did ask Canadians quite in great depth and across the country about this view on technology. Now, we didn't relate it specifically to work, but in general. And almost all age groups said it was very positive. The only thing, again, it's on work-life balance. That's where Canadians are most concerned, and their overall life satisfaction. So I think that's, this quality of work and how Canadians feel in general is, it's complex, but there's certain things that we do know. Like right now, for example, the labor market is very tight. I mean, it's low unemployment, et cetera, but we know that in some of our other surveys, such as General Social Survey, the Canadians are, by their life course, expressing different stresses or different concerns.
Okay, so the last year I've learned a new word. I see it always in the media. It's positivity. Positivity. So this positivity towards technology, totally new word, didn't exist when I was a kid. This positivity towards technology, how does that juxtapose with also, in your barometer, in your media part of the barometer, the large differential between trust of traditional old line media and trust of new forms of media, which has fallen, hasn't it?
Yeah, so in Canada, trust in social media is about 28%. And for traditional media, it's somewhere in the 70s. And we're actually seeing an increase in trust in traditional media in this country, which I would attribute to the fact that there are many media outlets who are investing in investigative journalism, and just the caliber of journalism has definitely improved over the last couple of years, despite all of the disruption that's happening within media.
Yeah, I don't want to indulge myself in media for too long, but I will tell you. But journalists are workers too, and humans. Well, they're not necessarily humans, but they're definitely workers. And we did focus groups across the country at one point, and people said that they got most of their news from Facebook. This is in the focus groups. They would say, "I get most of my news from Facebook, and I'm pretty good with that." And then in every group, somebody would stop and say, "Except if it's really important." And the moderator would say, "Well, what do you do when it's really important?" I said, "Well, if it's really important, I don't trust, my friends, my family. I know Facebook doesn't have reporters." And the moderator would say, "Well, who do you trust?" And then they would name individual newspapers, anchors on television stations, columnists. That's so they trust humans in the end, right? I think is one of those findings. I just want to stick with the barometer for a second to ask about the, kind of the bifurcation in a sense between, you measure trust among educated upper quartile income earners, and you measure against what you call the mass population. And those are two very different responses you get, aren't they?
Yeah, so what we've seen over the last couple of years is an increased polarization between the trust levels that exist between the informed public in terms of their trust in the four institutions that we measure versus that of the mass population. And this year, 2019, we actually saw the largest gap at 20 points between those two segments of the population. That is only behind the UK, which was at 24%. So that actually should set off alarm bells in this country about this growing trust inequality gap or polarization that exists between elites in the country and the mass population.
A lot of different forms of polarization going on, right? Jane, I guess one of also, one of the things in the quality area is access to pensions. And that's, clearly an important future of work issue and an important, security of the individual issue. What are you seeing there on that trend line?
Yeah, so we're looking at older workers. And we actually conducted a survey around older workers, and we're going to start collecting information on older workers, those 60 and older, why they're working, or why, what they're doing exactly in their main activity. There's an increasing number. There's no doubt that more people are working compared to, let's say, 30 years ago. And when we ask them why, about half are saying necessity. So it's not by choice. There are some of the more professional, self-employed are saying by choice, but really there's a growing number of workers that are out of necessity. They cannot afford to retire. So it's something we're going to follow through more on, but it is a phenomenon that we're seeing.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to end by going back to you. And one of the more counterintuitive, non-conventional wisdom things that you said was that the policy field is wide open. And I think most of us have come to be trained to believe that the policy field among people who feel disaffected about the economy and anxious about the future has been occupied more by parties of the right, and whether that's in Hungary or in Brexit England or in the U.S. or wherever that's being manifest. So, how do you come to this conclusion that the policy field is open? Isn't populism been associated pretty much with right of center parties over the last several years?
So, there's two things to say about it. I think that the Canadian specific case is that I think that we're at the political economy of our country right now is that for the most part, parties of the left, so particularly the New Democratic Party, have a hard time selling people on the combination of there being higher taxes for some group of people and then being able to underwrite massive new social programs. And I think people just don't believe it in some sense. They will believe that a small tax cut to those at the bottom of the income distribution can make those folks better off, and they think the parties can credibly deliver on that. And that, at a very high level, characterizes the debate that's going on in Canada between New Democratic parties and Conservative parties, and it certainly characterized the debate that happened in the last provincial election. So I think there's parties of the left are in a different box than parties of the right are right now. But more generally, if you dig into our data, what I would point out is that people who hold populist views in this country are more likely than those who don't vote populist views to vote for every party but the Liberal Party. This notion that that politicians are not out there for the interests of people is underwriting more support for every party but the government. I think that's a long-term thing you could probably see the more you go back. It's always hard to govern. It's always easy to say if you're outside of politics you would do it differently. But this large disaffection to the degree that it exists in the system about our political system and our political class is driving people to support all sorts of parties. The one thing I would say, just to go back 2 comments ago, I remember, just for what it's worth, in 1993, my brother got his plumbing ticket. He's a steam fitter plumber. Now he owns his own building company. But he got tooled by the government. When you got your ticket in those days, the government sent you a check for $500 to buy your tools because your employer wasn't going to do it, right? To kind of get your tool set going. And it was just a huge kind of shot right into his career, right? That he could now go out there and buy quality tools and do his thing. And there's a whole bunch of policy entrepreneurialism out there for parties or for governments that want to propose partnerships between governments and and employees where large companies and small companies can put money into an account for employees, and government can do it as well, and they can signal that this is important, that retraining is important, and investing in people is important. And there's all sorts of ways you can incentivize that through the tax system in a way that sends the right signal about people, right? And so this is, it's as much about the symbolics of it as it is about economics, right? But there's a wonderful opportunity here if people have high trust in corporations and high trust in their employers to treat them well, for government to create incentives for employers to let people train over the life cycle, right? And take that money with them if they go, right?
Okay, well, we'll see. I mean, I think you all believe there's an opportunity to get it right. And we'll see the scale because, the capacity to get it right might also depend on the complexity and the scale. But I think you got it right, so we appreciate that. Good conversation. It's the kickoff of a longer conversation tomorrow at the Mars Center of the Brave New Work Conference with a lot of very good panels and discussions. I'm not going to go over the agenda for you, but it's on our website. It's available. If you can't come to the conference or aren't coming to the conference, I'd let you know it's being live streamed, so you can participate in that way. And if you just haven't gotten around to coming and you still want to come, there's a bunch of PPF people in the room, maybe the PPF people in the room. Katie is back there and Masha is there and Tomic and I don't know, I think Julie, oh, there you are, Julie, and me. And I want to thank all those people who just put up their head for all the hard work that they've done on the conference and on this sort of warm up tonight. I want to thank all of you for attending, and I think people will be around for a few more minutes if you want to talk one-on-one with any of you up here. And the three of you, thank you so much for participating.
Thanks, Ed.